I'll show you how to set up WebSocket communication between an Expo app and the NestJS server. The server will track how many WebSocket connections the user has opened and send that information back to the app. The app can even ask the server to close one of its connections. And to prevent abuse, the server will enforce a connection limit. If the user tries to open too many, the server will reject the extra ones and notify the app. Link to the code that I'll show you in this video will be in the description on GitHub, and if you like my content, don't forget to subscribe. WebSockets are for two-way communication between a client and the server, unlike traditional one-way street with HTTP requests. It all starts with a handshake. I oversimplified it. It's not actually who's there, but it's an HTTP upgrade, request and response. After the connection, either side can initiate communication. Closing of the connection can be initiated either by the client or the server. Every WebSocket opens a file descriptor on the server and uses system resources. That means it's prone to exploit. One can open many connections and there are no infinite number of file descriptors, or one can keep opening and closing connections, causing another issue, same issue, exhaustion of system resources. That's called, I think, connection churn. My approach is allow only authenticated users to open a connection and limit the maximum number of connections that each user can have. I will start with NestJS server, installing dependencies first, and I will separate the WebSocket handling on NestJS in two parts. First part is responsible to opening a connection on the server. The second part will be the one that handles receiving and sending the messages. I think this is the most important part. Dealing with messages is easy. So let's start from the ground up. Simplest example for an event adapter, IO adapter, is creating an IO server, new WebSocket connection. It is wired to NestJS in the main, and you call it inject the use WebSocket adapter after the app is created. I want to limit who can make a connection. The first step is that I will expect an out token to be sent in a handshake. And I will just validate with Zod that the token exists. Otherwise, I will return unauthorized. If it exists, WebSocket connection can be opened. Simple private function helper that parses the socket handshake out. You can also pass the out token in a query, but I don't know. It looks better to pass it in the out. Next step would be to validate the token I got with Firebase service. And I inject the Firebase service in the event adapter, and then the token I get, I verify it with the Firebase and return the user ID. This can fail for all kinds of authentication error codes, but for the sake of this tutorial, I don't want to complicate it. I have it wrapped in a try catch, and in case of any kind of error, I will return the unauthorized exception. This unauthorized exception will turn up in the connect error if the socket client listens to it. User ID will be useful for my next class, so I will inject it in the socket data that can be passed to service that uses the socket. Last part of this check is guarding against too many connections. I will demo it in a test case after I show it. So let's say maximum number connection each user can have is 2. I need to keep track of the user connections to be able to decide there are too many. To avoid repetition, I keep a set, and if there are too many connections, I throw an error. I need to set a new connection if everything is okay, and I need to do a cleanup. Once there's a disconnect, I have to remove the item from the set or remove the entire map entry. And this covers my guard and authorization. Now I want to test my event adapter. I won't start from the beginning writing the code. I'll explain segment by segment. This is my helper method, which creates a WebSocket client, and I will test sending the messages. In this case, only I'll test the handshake. I need to spin up NestJS app and start listening on a port. In this case, I have made a helper for get port, which grabs the first available port from 3000 to 3100. That's just an extra, just to be sure that the port is not taken. This runs before all tests, and as usual, when all tests are done, there needs to be a cleanup to avoid test hangs. Cases I explained are exactly 4 cases. So one can send a handshake without a token be invalid or valid, and one can exceed maximum number of connections. For the sake of this test, my verify ID token coming from Firebase service out is a mock object. So it's not a pure end-to-end, but a hybrid of a unit test and an integration test. And when I run it, it's immediate. All of the test cases pass. Now on to the processing of messages from the client and from the server. Still on the NestJS. This class is a NestJS WebSocket Gateway, which means it can handle listening for incoming messages, like a subscribe message from the client, or it can send messages back to one or many clients. To send to many clients, you would keep track of the user connection. Since I want to keep track of the connected devices, I need to know the socket ID, user ID, IP address, user agent, and when it was created. User agent from the mobile will probably be undefined, but coming from web, I will see at least which browser is used. This decorator contains several properties. Of course, if running exclusively on mobile, it is irrelevant. This is a browser-only feature. This is needed for heartbeats, so server can keep sending heartbeats every 25 seconds. After 5 seconds of non-responsiveness of the client, it will issue disconnect. One more guard is limiting the maximum message size to be 1 megabyte, and transports, well, if I say exclusively WebSocket, that it can't fall back to long polling. In my handle connection, when the socket it is already connected because event adapter passed it through, I need to keep a track of user connections because I will send all of users' devices, and what I will sending message from the server to the client is controlled by my notify user function that I didn't still create. So my notify user is it's a public method because I can also inject this event gateway into other controllers and services. And for example, if I have a CRUD, create, update or delete of the resource, I can issue notify user so it's propagated to all of users' devices. And sending out the message from the server is just this. I need to know the address and emit the message and the payload. This message server client needs to register to listening of this message. And this exact message is tracking number of connections each user has. You will see later on the client. I also need to do a cleanup once the client disconnects because I keep track of user connections, and also when one connection is disconnected, I need to broadcast it to all of users' devices. When there's a disconnect request coming from the client, it can be any target socket ID, so I need to verify that it is really the user's device. I disconnect it if it's found and notify others users' devices. This covers sending of the client to the server and sending from the server to the client in the connections. One more thing, I will demonstrate use of the event gateway notify user on other resources. You can use it in CRUD actions, so whenever there's an update, create or delete, you broadcast it to all of users' devices. To be able to use it elsewhere, you need to export it and probably import the event module in other modules, but since I'm using it from the root app controller, I can just inject it in the constructor. If you followed my push notification tutorial, this is my spammy controller handler, which whenever I call it with a greeting, it broadcasts to all of registered devices with push notifications, and also broadcasts over a WebSocket connection if the client is registered to handle greeting. And now the client part is an Expo app. For the Expo app to work, it will also work in web and on native. You need the socketio client, and I made a hook which works only, registers only when the client is connected. As I mentioned, I need to send an authorization token, so I send it inside a handshake out. You could have also sent it in the query, but I think in the out object it is more secure. My socketio client deals with connection, heartbeats, and fallback to long polling if WebSocket fails. Since I mentioned server sends the connections back to the client, I want to save them and display them on the screen of the device. On the connect error, so those are two kinds of errors, unauthorized and too many connections. And requesting of disconnect is done by emitting a disconnect request, which is called in the Web Gateway over here, subscribe to message. Since users rarely completely exit the app, my way is I rather kill the WebSocket if the app is in the background because it's useless, and I also have push notifications. When the app becomes active again, then I reinitialize the WebSocket. I also need to register to greeting, and my payload of the greeting is just a message of string, and I will say I will issue an alert, and this covers it. My use WebSockets are called in the WebSocket connection screen, which renders all of the user's connections, and user can initiate a disconnect on a button press. And let's see now how it works. My device is connected to WebSocket, only one connection, so it says no other active connections, and this is my Swagger UI. I am signed in with Google Login. I can trigger my spammy route. If I execute, I will get a greeting from the server. If I connect one more device, it will say which device connected. Last step would be, one more step. One more step would be initializing one more connection, or I can limit it to just one. And if I limit it to just one, if I try to reconnect, it should say too many connections. If I bring it back to 2, it should start working again. I can also issue a disconnect, and this WebSocket will be disconnected. Oh, I need to fix it. Okay, this is better. When I issue a disconnect, it will say no more active connections. If I reconnect, I will see other WebSocket connections again. Okay, this covers it. What did I cover? Explaining what WebSockets are, something about security and guarding for WebSocket connections. I showed you how to create a simple hybrid integration test. And the last step was demoing the WebSocket connection between an Expo app and the NestJS server. All of the code is available on GitHub, link is in the description, and thank you for watching this video.